Slavery in America is often discussed in terms of forced labor. Fields of cotton, whips on backs, the struggle for freedom. But behind the whip and the auction block was another system, quieter but in many ways even more horrifying. The deliberate, systematic breeding of enslaved people for profit. When the importation of Africans was banned in 1808, slaveholders in the U.S. were faced with a question. How would they sustain their labor force? Their answer was cruel and calculating. They turned the wombs of enslaved women into their new supply line. For nearly 6 decades, the United States operated an internal slave breeding system. This wasn't accidental. It was an industry, supported by laws, by doctors, by politicians, and by traders. Human beings were treated like livestock, forced into sexual encounters, and children were ripped away to be sold to the highest bidder. Tonight, we'll dive into 10 disturbing facts about slave breeding and sex farms in America. This is not easy history to hear, but it is history we must confront. When Congress outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, enslavers didn't suddenly grow moral consciences. Instead, they shifted their business model. The fertile bodies of enslaved women became the center of their wealth strategy. Women were cataloged in plantation records not as daughters, mothers, or wives, but as breeders. Some ledgers went so far as to record the number of children a woman had born, her age of first pregnancy, and her projected fertility. Imagine being a young girl, 12 or 13 years old, and realizing that your owner wasn't thinking about your education or your future, but about how soon you could start having children. Some enslaved girls were forced into motherhood as teenagers, their first pregnancies often resulting from rape by their enslaver or overseer. These women had no control over their own bodies. Some were deliberately paired with men they did not choose. Others were forced to submit to sexual violence by the plantation owner himself. One historian described it bluntly: slaveholders bred people the way farmers breed animals. It's important to understand that this wasn't rare. This was not a handful of bad actors. This was a systemic practice across the Upper South, designed to fuel the ever-growing demand for enslaved labor in the Deep South. It's impossible to talk about slave breeding without talking about rape. Sexual violence was not a side effect of slavery. It was built into the system. From the very beginning on slave ships crossing the Atlantic, women were singled out for abuse. Once in America, they lived under constant threat. Owners, overseers, even visiting traders, all exercised sexual access to enslaved women. These assaults were about more than lust. They were about power, control, and profit. The children born of rape increased the enslaver's wealth, since by law, a child inherited the status of the mother. This is why sexual violence was so widespread. It generated new enslaved bodies to be sold or put to work. Take the case of Sally Hemings, enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. Beginning as a teenager, she bore at least 6 of Jefferson's children. None were freed in Jefferson's lifetime, though some later gained their freedom quietly. Hemings' story isn't an exception. It's just one of the few we know because of who her enslaver was. Others resisted. The enslaved woman Celia in Missouri fought back after years of rape by her enslaver, killing him in desperation. The law did not see her as a victim. She was convicted of murder and hanged, her execution scheduled after she gave birth so her unborn child could be sold. Stories like these make it clear the sexual exploitation of enslaved women was not incidental. It was deliberate. Perhaps the cruelest feature of the breeding system was what happened after birth. Babies were rarely allowed to stay with their mothers. Slave traders made fortunes selling infants and young children. They were considered prime stock because they represented a lifetime of labor. To the enslaver, a baby was money in the bank. To the mother, it was heartbreak. Enslaved women described the trauma of seeing their children dragged away. Historian Edward Baptist recorded accounts of mothers crying out in grief as their children were sold. Some fainted on the auction block. Others tried to run. Frederick Douglass himself recalled the wails of mothers separated from their children. He wrote, "My own mother was snatched from me when I was but an infant. Before I knew her as my mother, children were sold as early as toddlers. Some were marched in chains hundreds of miles away. They never saw their parents again. Slaveholders didn't just separate families. They destroyed the very concept of family. Marriage between enslaved people wasn't recognized by law. A father could not protect his children. A mother could not guarantee she would see her baby grow. This was not accidental cruelty. It was a business strategy. By breaking bonds of kinship, enslavers weakened resistance and made each person dependent only on the master. While women endured constant pregnancies, some men were coerced into a different kind of exploitation. Enslavers selected men for their physical traits, height, build, strength, and forced them into repeated sexual encounters with women to increase reproduction. In many cases, enslavers rewarded men who fathered the most children with small privileges, extra food, lighter work, or temporary relief from punishment. But the reward was also a trap. These men were not exercising agency. They were being used as human stud animals. This stripped enslaved men of dignity and agency, turning intimate human relationships into transactions. It also undermined traditional family structures, creating resentment and conflict within enslaved communities. Enslavers sometimes used this to sow division, pitting men against one another, weakening solidarity. And while some men complied under duress, others resisted, but resistance often led to brutal punishments. Not all enslaved women were treated the same. Those who were seen as particularly fertile or who had proven themselves capable of multiple births were prized by their owners. Some were spared the heaviest field labor during pregnancy. Others received better rations or clothing. But these were not privileges. They were investments. Owners wanted to keep these women alive long enough to produce more children. Plantation ledgers often noted women as prime breeding stock. One advertisement listed a woman for sale specifically mentioning she had already birthed 6 healthy children. Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, recounted how her enslaver relentlessly pressured her to submit sexually. When she resisted, he threatened to sell her children. This illustrates the double-edged cruelty. A woman's children were both her greatest love and her greatest vulnerability. By the 19th century, the internal slave trade was a booming business. States like Virginia and Maryland became known as breeding grounds, while the Deep South was the demand center. Traders organized massive slave auctions. In New Orleans, the largest slave market in the country, thousands were sold each year. Newspaper ads openly described women as good breeders and promoted their ability to produce increase. The domestic slave trade was worth millions annually, enriching traders and plantation owners alike. The wealth of the South, and indeed much of the United States, was built on this market. One notorious trader, Isaac Franklin, not only sold thousands of enslaved people, but also exploited enslaved women himself, fathering dozens if not hundreds of children he then sold. For him, rape was both personal gratification and business strategy. This was not just commerce, it was a calculated, large-scale industry, one that turned human lives into a perpetual cycle of profit. Slaveholders often enlisted doctors to monitor pregnancies and fertility. These medical professionals weren't concerned with the health of enslaved women out of compassion. They were hired to protect investments. Doctors measured pelvic sizes, checked reproductive health, and advised on how to increase births. Some experimented on enslaved women without consent. The most infamous example is Dr. J. Marion Sims, celebrated as the father of modern gynecology. Sims perfected surgical procedures by operating on enslaved women without anesthesia, believing they didn't feel pain the same way white women did. These women endured excruciating experiments, and yet their names are rarely remembered. Sims became famous, his statue erected in New York City. Only in recent years have calls for its removal highlighted the hidden suffering behind his advances. The involvement of doctors shows how slavery wasn't just an agricultural system. It was upheld by science, medicine, law, and every institution of American life. Despite being forced into constant pregnancies, enslaved women often saw their babies die. The reasons were cruelly simple: poor nutrition, relentless labor, inadequate medical care, and deliberate neglect. Women were expected to work until late in pregnancy. After birth, many were given only a few days before returning to the fields. Babies were left in the care of older children or the elderly, often without sufficient food. On some plantations, more than half of infants died before the age of 1. This wasn't seen as tragedy by enslavers. It was simply loss of stock. The psychological toll was devastating. Mothers grieved child after child, forced to endure repeated cycles of loss while still being compelled to conceive again. This practice reveals the grotesque contradiction of slavery. Enslavers treated black bodies as both indispensable and disposable at the same time. When slavery was legally abolished in 1865, many assumed the horrors of breeding and sex farms ended too. But in reality, the systems of exploitation continued in new forms. In places like Natchez, Mississippi, fancy girls, young black women, often mixed race, were sold into sexual slavery well after the Civil War. Sharecropping and tenant farming trapped many freed families in cycles of poverty, while convict leasing turned prisons into new plantations. Black women, no longer legally enslaved, were still vulnerable to sexual violence from white men, with little protection from the courts. The scars of forced breeding didn't vanish with emancipation. They lingered in the trauma of families who had been repeatedly torn apart, in the silence around ancestry, in the systemic inequalities that persist today. Perhaps most disturbingly, leaders of the time openly defended slave breeding as essential. Senator James Henry Hammond argued that raising slaves domestically was more cost-effective than importing them. Planters wrote about breeding the Negro race as though they were cattle, calculating the profits of children yet unborn. Some northern businessmen, while not owning plantations, financed the trade, ensuring slave shipments and reaping the benefits. The system was not just Southern, it was American. This reveals the cold heart of slavery. It was never only about labor. It was about reducing people to units of profit, stripping away humanity in the name of economics. The story of slave breeding and sex farms is one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. It shows us that slavery was not just about whips and chains. It was about total domination of body, mind, and family. These practices remind us that slavery was not simply a labor system. It was a machine of dehumanization, one that treated human beings as renewable resources, robbed them of family, and weaponized even the act of childbirth. And its echoes remain. The forced separation of families, the systemic control of black women's bodies, the legacy of generational trauma. These are not distant ghosts. They are part of the living memory of America. To move forward, we must face these truths unflinchingly, not to wallow in pain, but to honor the resilience of those who endured, to acknowledge the full scope of what was done, and to ensure such horrors are never forgotten. If you found this video informative, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into hidden history. And remember, history is not just about the past. It's about the systems and legacies that still shape our present.